Hi, everyone, and welcome to Coffee and Conversations brought to you by Corben and Lane. Corben and Lane is a customer-centric team of industry experts with the primary objective of accelerating your business. We specialize in providing diversified solutions around product development, sourcing, production, and business expansion. Our focus is centered around apparel, accessories, footwear, and home. We work with fast-growing and established brands to provide access to our world-class team that will customize solutions and help fine-tune brand strategy based on the need of each client. Today, I have with me Camila Gomez-Wills, who is a program manager with 5 years of experience working with private firms, government agencies, and international funders to develop actionable, responsible sourcing policies. As a problem solver and creative, she develops bespoke strategies for Fortune 500 companies to address high-risk ESG business issues and is known for her ability to communicate effectively across a broad range of audiences. She cares deeply about human dignity and agency and is dedicated to finding solutions for responsible sourcing, as well as best practices to ultimately put an end to modern slavery in our supply chains. Welcome, Camila.
Thanks so much for having me, Irina. I'm excited by this conversation.
Me too. Let's dive in. So, made in the USA is a category that has some sort of, denotes that it's a better produced product. Let's talk about legislation in the US and how we still have some more room for improvement.
Sure thing. So I think part of what frames this conversation is this idea that products that are made in the US domestically will have better working conditions than in other countries, in kind of the consumer mindset. And what research has shown, both from universities, auditing firms, et cetera, is that oftentimes this isn't the case. And there's problems with wage theft, excessive overtime, often having to do with migrant workers, but not necessarily, also with people that are from the US and have documentation to prove it. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to push for, and especially in California, where I'm currently based in, is for improved protections, particularly for garment workers. So for consumers, even though we generally think of it as being better working conditions, sometimes companies here don't pay the wages that they should be paying, whether that be minimum wages, depending on the state, or the federally mandated minimum wage. And what we're seeing now is a push, as I said, in California particularly, that will perhaps expand to other places, to have stricter protections for workers that are involved in making the clothes we use every day. One really important caveat is that we already have legislation that in theory should be doing this. And it was initially enacted in 1999. And it's known as AB 633 in California. And the idea was that workers could file claims against the contractor who hired them or the manufacturer of the garments that produce them. But what we've seen is that this really has not been very much put in place. And even federally done investigations. The US Department of Labor did an investigation in 2016, and most of the factories in LA were not really paying the workers their fair minimum wage. So that's part of the problem with the current system. But as we're going to talk on later today, part of that has to do with the purchasing practices of the retailers that are relying on these sometimes smaller, medium manufacturers in LA and elsewhere. So where do we currently stand with the California legislation? What is being proposed and may or may not become enforceable in the near future, perhaps this year even, is that, first of all, it would prohibit the piece rate. And what that means is paying workers by the item instead of by the amount of time done. So if you made X amount of t-shirts, this is your wages for the day. That would be prohibitive. It would authorize investigations of wage theft, and it would expand the liability to include not only the manufacturers, but also the retailers that are relying or contracting these facilities to produce their clothes. So for me, a big kind of takeaway of the momentum we're seeing locally, and that will hopefully expand to other places in the US. I mean, apparel yes, in LA is crucial, but that doesn't mean that there isn't apparel manufacturing elsewhere too. So maybe this push will raise the tide for other manufacturing facilities elsewhere, is that California can become a leader in responsibly manufactured apparel, and made in the USA can eventually be better made clothing, and clothing that we can ensure has better working conditions behind it. But that is currently not the case. We're starting to see movement in that direction, but made in the USA is currently not an assurance that people were paid a minimum wage, or even living wage, if we were to aim even higher.
Sure. You mentioned that retailers and brands are maybe unwillingly creating these conditions. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Sure. And I think this dives into the work that the Better Buying initiative has been doing for some time. And I really encourage listeners and those that are joining us today to take a look at their work. But really, what data has shown is that the purchasing practices that a brand have a very direct impact on the working conditions of the manufacturers. So for example, the lead time that you give a manufacturer, or last minute changes in color swatches, or our garment fit, garment style, etc., really push manufacturers to then perhaps, and I'm not saying that's the only possibility, but could push manufacturers to excessive overtime, or overtime that isn't optional. So overtime per se is not illegal. Overtime is fine as long as you can choose to do it and it's compensated accordingly. But the problem becomes is when you're doing excessive overtime, you don't have a choice. And it's also, what we mean by excessive is that it's above the statutory maximums of how much a person could be working on a weekly basis. The other element we've seen that is affected by this is the kind of race to the bottom in terms of pricing. So when procurement teams make decisions of what manufacturer they're going to go with solely based on price, and are asking for lower and lower and lower prices, this pushes manufacturers to really cut prices as much as they can. And when we're building a product that has fixed input costs, the only wiggle room we have really is with the wages of workers. And I don't want to get too technical here with the economics of it, but basically we can't really change, or a manufacturer can't change the cost of their inputs, of their fibers or of their dyes or whatnot. They can't change the cost of their electricity bill. They can't negotiate that, so on and so forth. But they do have the possibility of turning the knob on lower or higher wages. So that's an unfortunate condition of our current production system, in which the people and the lower paid workers in our supply chain are those that are taking the brunt for the push for lower and lower prices in our apparel manufacturing processes.
Definitely. I think that, workers are also banding together, correct, in terms of kind of looking for some of those longer term assurances and contracts. Is that the case?
Well, yes and no. Do you mean workers or the manufacturers themselves?
Well, the workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that is what we would like to see, but in the current setup in which the worker has very small negotiation power, and workers, especially in these kind of lower paying tiers of our workforce, and that manufacturers are kind of replacing all the time with the high unemployment levels that we have in some of the manufacturing communities in the US, they don't really have sufficient leverage to push for improvements. So if anything, the pandemic and the scarcity of workers under the current conditions, what has shown us is that working conditions and pay at least has improved in some sectors. So I don't know how it is where you live, but at least here in California, in San Diego, where I live, a lot of places that maybe weren't offering $15 or $16, $17 wages are now doing that, and are very clearly advertising it to get workers on board. But that's not necessarily something that has come from worker organizing, so to speak, but by conditions that have forced employers to finally pay people something that allows them to work regular hours doing one job in order to sustain their families, pay rent, etc.
That makes sense. A lot of our brands, Camila, are based in the US and are currently working globally. What would you recommend is the best way to vet some of your suppliers and factories when you are working globally with partners that you can't physically go and visit for one reason or another?
Yeah. I like this question because it touches on kind of the practicality of this. And I know that many brand owners maybe have their best interests at heart and want to do the right thing, but what does that actually translate to on a day-to-day basis? And the first thing I would say, so kind of step one, is to really try and establish long-term relationships with your manufacturers. And if a retailer or small brand or whatever, startup even, is willing to demonstrate that they trust the manufacturer and that they're willing to commit to X seasons, years, hopefully, of working with them, manufacturers will also be willing to invest in what it takes to have better conditions in the factory. And I don't mean only wages, but also health and safety, emergencies, et cetera, all these things that are required by law, but that will require an investment by the manufacturer. So that would be one element that I'd bring up. Another element that I'd bring up is to a little bit kind of, I understand that audits are one tool and one piece of the puzzle. So yes, check the certifications of the manufacturers that you're working with, but I'd say don't rely solely on certifications because, well, A, they can be easily falsified in the current day and age that we live in, but also even when they are true certifications and the certifying body has demonstrated, yes, they do meet the requirements to be certified, sometimes that misses larger problems of really harder to catch, let's say, issues and human rights violations in the factories that could have to do with discrimination, with harassment, with restrictions around freedom of association, et cetera. So don't rely solely on those certifications. The third step that I'd bring up is really try to join collectives and groups and kind of keep an ear to the ground on what is going on in this space and be as involved with trade fairs, stakeholder groups. I'm familiar with a few of them. We can kind of drop them in the chat later or share later on, but really try and join more collective organizations that are working on this and that have relationships with suppliers that are walking the talk. And then last but not least, and this touches on the purchasing practices, is think about it beyond price. I mean, if you're going to go and look for who can provide your swimsuits, shoes, purses, whatever, fill in the blank for 30 cents cheaper, for X margin cheaper than anyone else, more likely than not, that won't be the best, neither for the environment in terms of their toxic waste management, nor for the workers that are involved in that production process.
That makes sense. There's a reason why it's the cheapest solution, I guess, right?
Right.
And it has to come from somewhere. You mentioned,
and it's the hidden cost, you know.
Yes.
It appears to be cheaper in terms of cents, but someone else is paying the cost of it appearing cheaper and less costly to the brand.
No, definitely. One of the things that we like to do with our customers is make sure that they have a solid business plan. You brought that up as a way to interact with your manufacturer. I think that when the manufacturers see what the plan is over the course of time, there is more willingness to work together to create a higher level of transparency. And I think that it ultimately creates a better working relationship, because sometimes the one-off, I'm just gonna, do this one production run and see how it goes. It doesn't tend to create that trust and that relationship building factor. And I think that for for you to work with a company that's halfway across the world, it's absolutely critical to be able to keep that relationship strong.
Absolutely. And having it be communication back and forth. And that's part of what I like about the Better Buying Index. It's that it's not only the manufacturers being, told, okay, this is what you need to do, and this is the terms we need it by, but the manufacturer is also being able to provide feedback to the retailers of, when you do this, this is actually the impact that it has on us. So being able to kind of have an open communication flow in both directions, I think, is crucial.
That's great. Camila, thank you so much for your insights. I think this is really important information because we talk about sustainability and we tend to associate that word with our raw materials, with our manufacturing processes, but I don't think we always tend to look at it in terms of the people and the people side of sustainability. So this is really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. And I think for sure, as you just said, sustainability and being truly sustainable for our planet and for the people that inhabit it relies on improving the working conditions. And I think my invitation for the brands that you work with and with those that listen to this conversation is, our challenge is building a connection between the products that we're wearing and that we will continue to wear with the people that were involved in making them, from the raw material all the way through to the store where we shopped it at.
Most definitely. Thanks again, Camila.
Thank you so much.